Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We turn now in Unit 1 to the first text, actual text, that we will be analyzing on page 28, 29, and following. We're going to spend a few moments now with W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw, a story that a number of you will say upon finishing, you will not soon forget. It is a story which creates a whole lot of questions in the mind. Before we get to the actual story, though, I want to start at 2B. We often begin here at the rhetorical level of study. Let's go to work with it really quickly. Jot down a couple of things. Now, this should be review for you as sophomores, but nonetheless, let's go through it one more time and make sure we feel comfortable with it. Let's start, first of all, with this concept of plot. Write that one down at 2B quickly and on your annotations. What do we mean when we talk about plot? We are talking, of course, about the map of the story, right? The events as they happen. Of course, here, the sequence of related events in the story is the formal definition from your book on page 29. Of course, the plot revolves around a conflict, a struggle between opposing forces, and follows a certain structure or pattern. Notice, again, the exposition, the background of character, situation, setting, and all of that. Rising action, events that intensify the conflict, and again, the conflict can be either an internal conflict or an external conflict. Internal conflict, character versus self. External conflict, character versus another character. Character versus nature. Character versus society or an idea. Reaching finally the climax, which is the highest point of story tension at which outcome of conflict is revealed. We like to say this is when the conflict comes to its ultimate fruition, right? We have the falling action of the denouement, the tying together the events following the climax, and then sometimes in stories we have the resolution, remaining issues resolved, conclusions, insights revealed by narrator. The other topic we want to write down at 2B, write this down, is foreshadowing. That notion of giving details that hint at upcoming events. We also want to write down the term flashback. We're familiar with this concept because in our freshman year we studied Homer's Odyssey. We know all about that flashback series of stories, the contest with Polyphemus, for example, because Odysseus ended up on the island of the Phaeacians and had to tell his story about where he had been in the form of flashback. Hey, do you see that map diagram there on page 29? At least look at it. That ought to look familiar to you as students who have finished your freshman year. Finally, do you see it at the bottom of page 29? Good stories, I would say good texts. All kinds of texts, poems, plays, essays. If they're constructed well, they have a tendency to challenge the reader and or viewer to make predictions, as in what will happen next. We're definitely going to play that game in this text, The Monkey's Paw. Now, hey, on page 30, do you see there those vocab words? We want to be paying attention to those words, obviously. Make sure we feel comfortable with those as we get ready for our assessment. Hey, let's say a couple of things for your notes about Jacobs really quickly. Note your dates, 1863 to 1943, okay? As a boy, William Wymar Jacobs traveled far and wide in his imagination, lived in London, England, in a house near the docks, listened eagerly to the tales of adventure told by sailors whom he met there. These tales shaped the stories he wrote as an adult, stories in which everyday life is disrupted by strange and fantastic events. We want to write that term down. Strange and fantastic events. We're going to see that in this story, obviously. The Monkey's Paw is his most famous tale of the supernatural. So in other words, let's put it in our notes. We're going to have some things that are beyond the natural in a story like this. Although today W. Jacobs is best known for this tale of suspense, in his own lifetime he was famous as a humorist. In fact, he wrote works of various kinds, and he wrote them in quantity. When a collection of his works was published in 1931, it contained 17 books. Whoa! So in other words, Jacobs was a prolific writer. By the way, the Do You Know movie makers have told the strange tale of the Monkey's Paw 8 times. 8 different times this has been turned into a film. First film version made in 1915. Most recent remakes came out in 96 and 2003. The background for the story, the British view of India. Let's write this one down from our box on page 31. The Monkey's Paw tells of an eerie object that arrives in England from India. From the late 1700s until 1947, India was a British colony. In letters and visits back home, British soldiers passed on information and misinformation about India's culture. Before long, India came to represent the mysterious and the supernatural as this story shows. The first thing I want to suggest, and hey, already as sophomores, and we're just early on in our time together, but I just want to make this point to you. We as more maturing readers will, I hope, in our sophomore year, do what in our freshman year we probably never did very often at all, and that is, before we ever read a text, we always want to scan that text. By scan, what do I mean? You're always looking ahead to see how the text is constructed. Can I make a point really quickly that's already ACT prep? When you begin the ACT, the first thing you will do on the reading section is to scan the text. See how long it is, see if you have any sense of who the author of the text is on the reading side, and try and get a sense of some activating prior knowledge, as we often say it. Let me give you an example. Hey, do you see on page 32 that little number in that orange circle? Turn the page a couple of pages. Do you see on page 37 the number 2? Do you see this? Turn the page. Do you see on page 39 the number 3? Do you see that? What this tells us is that this story is divided for us into 3 parts. So let me make a suggestion right now at level 1. As we get ready to do this story right now at level 1, write 1, skip several lines. Write Roman numeral 2, skip several lines. Write Roman numeral 3. And for each one of these sections then, right, make sure that you can summarize what happens in that section at level 1. That's going to help us immensely. Now our challenge here is to just follow along with our professional reader as we have done in the past and do our best to try to stay focused, keep concentrating to try and figure out what's going on. Now obviously this is one of those short stories where the title doesn't give away a lot but might attract our curiosity. What is up with this title, The Monkey's Paw? We'll obviously have some comments about this one, all right? All right, here we go. The Monkey's Paw. Let's play the game now really quickly, see how well we do, all right?
The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet. But in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the 3rd glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding.
Now let's pause for a moment. Just put this at level 1. Not unusual in a lot of stories, fiction stories, we will often have the story within the story. So notice in the exposition at the beginning of the story, we just have kind of a dad and his son are attempting to play chess, that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, some stranger shows up who is going to begin to kind of relate a series of event stories. Notice how this kind of storytelling approach, let's put it in our notes at 2b. Notice this kind of storytelling approach will draw you, the reader, in to kind of want to hear or listen to this interesting story that's about to be told. All right, here we go. Let's go to work with it. See how well we do.
Looking at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely.
Page 34.
I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man. Just to look round a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastwise, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him.
Now, write this down at 3A. One of the great writers that we will study in high school and then on into university, who is really good at this kind of storytelling, is Joseph Conrad. Conrad loves to play this game as well, and we see it often in his stories like Heart of Darkness and O Youth. The idea now is, notice, they're all leaning in because they're ready to hear this really strange story from an exotic place like India. And you as a reader want to try to quickly get to the heart of the story as well. What is this guy going to tell us about this strange story from this strange place called India? Let's take a look.
To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was 35. For death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
Of course, let's pause for a moment. Put it at level 1 now. Again, we're in the first section of the story, yes? So we've got this monkey's paw that's mummified, kind of gross in the way we think about it. And the suggestion is, if you have this paw, you have wishes that can be granted to you. 3 wishes. This is, of course, an ancient motif. It comes out of the 1001 Nights and all of that kind of stuff, right? The Aladdin story, some of you know of it as, right? That motif. And here, notice, he takes the paw, he throws it in the fire, yes, and he wants to let it burn. Mr. White, the father, will take it out of the fire and say, if you don't want it, I will want it. Pause for a moment and try and make a prediction of what you think's about to happen here. I'll ask it in generalities, good or bad. What do you think? All right, let's keep going. Watch how this one unfolds, all right?
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White,
right, Arabian
as she
Nights.
rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, Father? Inquired Mrs. White,
Page
regarding
36.
her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, Father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he
Page
felt on
37.
the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed.
All right, so wish number one is part number one. You can see how the story is now dividing easily, right? And the promise is, whatever you wish for, you get. What was the promise and what happened when the promise was made? Of course, the promise here, notice ironically, he says, I can't, Herbert says, the old man says, I don't know what to wish for, Mr. White. He says, that's a fact. He says, I have everything I need. I don't know what to wish for, he says. It seems to me I've got all I want. There will be irony in this statement by the end of the story, as you can imagine, right? Then notice the suggestion is, I wish for 200 pounds. Herbert will be left then looking into the fire, and it's as if he sees the face of a monkey. Of course, let's put it in our notes. After the wish is made, the paw is dropped onto the floor because the old man, Mr. White, is convinced that it moves for a second. This old mummified monkey's paw moves. And now all of a sudden, the question is, as we're beginning to prognosticate or predict, what do you think happens next, right? Okay, here we go. Part two. Let's get ready for the reading now. Part two, let's see what happens.
In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they